Hello, everyone, and welcome to our online track of a Flow Conference fall season of 2023. And this is an online part of our conference. There will be an offline part soon. But today we have a very special guest and a warm welcome to Andres Sacco. Andres is a computer expert with experience in various languages like Java, PHP, Node.js, and also you might know him for his collaboration with Manning and Apress publishers. He took part in preparation of a number of books and courses. And of course, I think many of you know Andres as a speaker at JAC conferences. I think this is his fifth presentation. Hi, Andres. How are you? Where are you connecting from today?
Hi, Ivan. I'm from Buenos Aires, Argentina. Near
Wow.
a lot of distance from Moscow.
Yeah, actually, yes. Actually, from St. Petersburg. I'm in St. Petersburg now. I took all the way from London to St. Petersburg to be at JUG.ru office today. But unfortunately, positive COVID test prevented me from visiting JUG.ru office. So it still happens. But thanks God, we are online. This is an online part. Okay. So could you explain in a few words the topic of your talk, what it's going to be about?
Okay, most of us, or most of the developers, create a lot of microservices, and everything looks fine at the beginning. But at some point of the life, you decide that these microservices need to be deprecated for many reasons, performance issues or whatever. And you need to think in a process to deprecate, modify, or delete that microservices without affecting the entire platform. These kind of problems I will tell you in this talk.
Okay, got it. Yeah. Anyway, life goes on, and of course, we all wish to build the system once and for all, but anyway, we have to modify our system or migrate it from time to time. Okay, to our listeners, please don't forget to participate in the chat. There's a chat on your screens, and there's a Telegram chat. I will closely monitor it, and any questions you have, please type in there, and I will ask Andres later. And in the meanwhile, I think it's a good time to start the recording because this session is pre-recorded. And let's not waste time. Let's start.
So this talk tackle these kind of problems and try to give you some possible advice or suggestion to reduce the risk that this migration or deprecation process will fail. But first, let me introduce me. My name is Andres Sacco. I work as developer since 2007 using different technologies. Most of them are connected with the JVM like Java, Scala, Kotlin, and other many languages. Also, I participate as technical reviewer on some of the biggest editorials around the world. I publish some courses or books. Some of them appear at the bottom of the presentation. And also, I participate as a speaker on different conferences. Also, in the slide you have my contact information, my LinkedIn, my Gmail. So if you have any doubts, any question after this presentation, please send me a message and I will try to help you as soon as possible. If in the message could give me some overview about your problem, is a great advance. And I will try to help you. So it's time to start with the problem. You have a big and old microservices that you want to deprecate. And why you want to deprecate an old microservices? And here are the reasons. First one, it's too old and difficult to maintain. As I started to mention, at the beginning everything it's okay. You created a microservices, you interact a lot with your development team and say, okay, we need a microservices or we need something that cover this feature or these functionalities, and I think are all have some kind of connection. So please try to put together and your developer team create a microservices. But at some point, these microservices become too old and difficult to maintain. And there are other problems related with this situation. The second one is you contain a lot of endpoints. So at the beginning, everything looks fine, just one or two or three different endpoints. More or less, the API makes sense and have a purpose. But at some point, you decide, okay, add a new endpoint for that reason and add another one. And when you open the Swagger or the documentation, you see a big list of endpoints, and you say, oh, I don't understand what is the idea of these microservices, and receive a lot of requests at the same time. So at some point, this is not a good idea for a microservices. You have performance issues because if you have a big old source code in one place with a lot of endpoint, at some point you will discover there are some problems related with the performance and increment the use of CPU or the memory, different kind of problems. Or it's the cost of each server on your cloud provider is a huge. So you need to find a way to solve this problem. And the last one is your team that have the experience with this kind of language. Imagine that these microservices was created, I don't know, 10 years ago. No, well, 5 years ago. And now the technology changed a lot. So the new developers in your team don't have experience about what is this technology, what is this dependency. And there are many solutions for the problems related with the performance, but are not available on that version of the language or that version of the library. So, what things you need to consider? It's not simple. There are some situations that you need to consider when you want to deprecate or replace or do a migration for a new microservices, and are not simple. The first one is you don't have the information about which are the consumers of your API. You publish your API, you distribute a Swagger with all the endpoints at some point in the past, and you miss or you lost the control about who are the consumers of your API. You don't know how many others APIs use your endpoints. So, okay, if I deprecate, what happened with all the consumers? Who are? It's difficult to measure the impact of the changes. If I don't know who are my consumers, how many of them exist, it's difficult to say, okay, perhaps it's just one consumer. I can contact by email, by LinkedIn. It's simple. 1 week. I developed the new version of the microservices, and in 1 week we will deprecate. Everything's okay. Yeah, great, but you don't know how many consumers exist. And perhaps you think, oh yeah, I only send the Swagger to just one person. And what happens if that person sent to another one? And you don't have the control at some point. It's difficult to maintain both microservices because at some point you decide, okay, I will build or create the new version of the microservices. Yeah, great. Deploy to production, everything looks fine at the beginning. But, okay, in the meantime, what happened with the both version, the old one and the new one? Because in the meantime, between you waiting that your consumer do the migration, both microservices need to live together. So what happened if there is a bug in the old one? You fix in the new one, you fix in the old one, what you want to do? There are many things or many questions that you need to solve. It's not so simple. And the last one is the first time that your team do a migration. It's a complex process. It's not like something that, okay, just in 5 minutes we decide how we'll do the deprecation process, send an email, we develop the new version of the microservices in 1 week, and everything is okay. No, there are many things that you need to consider. And during this talk, the idea is give you some clues or some suggestions, so the next time that you need to deprecate an API or remove an API, you can have a plan which reduces the failure of this process. And why this migration could fail? Well, first one, you don't have a plan. It's the first thing that you need to consider. If you don't have a plan, you don't need or you don't know the steps that you need to follow to achieve the goal. Your goal is deprecate the old version of the microservices. Value communication with your consumer, and this not imply, okay, perhaps I put a bad name of my variable or my employee. No, don't mean this. It's like I don't send an email to my consumers and notify about the process. So if I don't notify about the process, perhaps the consumers don't understand the problem or the impact of the changes. So this is another reason. And the last one is you have a bad strategy to do a migration, because you can have a plan, but a plan needs to have a strategy. What happens if something bad occurs during the migration? What happens if you discover other problems during this process? So all these things you need to consider. Which is the impact of not have a plan? Well, you have a high risk of failure. This is so obvious, but in some cases, the people don't think about the impact. You don't have the definition of the steps, because the plan needs a series of steps. It's not like my idea is migrate to a new version of the API, and this is the plan. But the end of the year, yes, great, and the steps. And you need to consider a series of steps that this plan need to have. You don't have the responsibilities. It's not like, oh, I don't know, all the team are responsible to do the migration. No, you need to define a person. Who on your team or how many of the members of your team are responsible for the process. Could be the business analyst, could be the technical leader, who could be both at the same time. It's something that you need to define. How will you measure the advance of this migration? Okay, great, you have a migration plan, but how you can measure? How many requests the all microservices still receive? How you can measure in a week, in a month, in a quarter, each day, and which tools you use to this? And what happens if something bad happens? As I mentioned, what happens if your process fails? You need to have like a plan B or plan C that solve most of these kind of problems. So what implies this about communication? Well, you don't communicate to your consumers your idea, your plan, all the steps, all the goals, which things you need to consider, the documentation. You don't define a deadline. This is so important. You need to define a deadline. Okay. We will give you support to this endpoint until this date. After that, this endpoint, if fail, it's not my responsibility, because I send all the documentation, all the process, I send all the information. So it's like, if you don't define a deadline, your consumer don't have the responsibility to do the migration. It's like, oh, it's not my problem. Not follow or track the advance of this process. Okay, you need to define like some kind of methodology to track the advance of this process. Tell me if something bad happened, but it's like it's not a good idea. Okay, we need to have a meeting or something like that. In a couple of minutes we will discuss about this. Not documenting the process well, how you can do the migration, which step you need to follow. Okay, this endpoint change the name from this to this. This attribute change the name of the attribute. Instead we return, I don't know, a number, we will return a string. All these kind of things need to be documented. And lastly, or last of the problems, what implied about the strategy? Well, you set unrealistic expectation to do a migration, like as I mentioned, okay, in 1 week my consumers will do the migration, and no, it's not possible. So you need to coordinate at some point with your consumers and define a realistic deadline for your API. Create the new microservices with a wrong approach. It's like you set you choose bad technologies. You don't check if everything works fine. If not, this technology don't have a problem of performance, because you say, okay, we will move from these microservices to this one because have a big good performance, and after that all the problems appear again. This is a failure on the strategy. Well, choose, as I mentioned, and not checking if the new microservices work fine or not. Okay, I will create a new microservices that more or less have the same endpoints and receive the same parameters and return me more or less the same response. Okay, everything, it's okay. But you check it, okay, you send, I don't know, the same request to the old microservices and the new one, and you check that both responses are more or less the same, because perhaps you are in the new API you remove one attribute, but most of the response likes similar, so you need to check. And what happened with the new, or with the request that continue receiving your old microservices? What happened? You need to find a strategy what you want to do with this request. If you don't decide nothing, or you don't write in a plan this kind of strange situation, but that happened during the process, when you find the situation, when you discover that this happened, you say, oh, what I want to do, I don't know, give me more time. No more time. It's time that you have a plan and you need to follow. This plan need to have changes, but you have a plan. How you to succeed in a migration? So a migration plan have 5 steps. The first one is to define a plan, as I mentioned, with all the steps that need to consider this migration. The second one is create a microservices. In the case that you don't have the new version of the microservices, or the new the microservices that will add this endpoint that will be deprecated on the old one, you need to create it. This is totally optional, because perhaps you say, okay, I know that I want to deprecate, so my first step is create the new endpoint, the new microservices, and after that I will create the migration plan. It's totally optional, the order. The next one is check if the new microservices with the old one more or less do the same. And these 2 steps, the second one and the third, as I mentioned, could be the first one of this process. Next, you need to notify to your consumer about your idea about this migration or deprecation process, and check the advance of this process. And the last one, which is the most important, is deprecate the old one, because you need to stop the use of the old one. So let's start with the first plan, the first part on this process. First one is define a plan to do a migration. And a migration or a plan of migration need to have a series of things. First one, you need to a goal, which is that you want to achieve with this migration plan. The second one is know which are your consumers. And we will, in a couple of meetings, we will see in detail each of them. The deadlines for the internal or external consumers, how many weeks or months or quarters that you want to wait until that these microservices disappear, your strategy, what happened if in the case that you continue receiving requests. You need to define the responsibles. Could be one person or many people on your team. It's not a good idea. Again, as I mentioned, not all the team could be responsible of the migration process. My suggestion is always like give you the responsibility to your business analyst, because it's someone that have the possibility or the skills to communicate with many other people inside of the inside on the company or outside of the company, and could be interact with many other people that could be not a technical person. It could be, I don't know, other business analyst, and it's not in your idea. It's not possible that okay, this is my developer and could explain to another developer or for another team. This could happen, but in most of the cases not happen. The communication, you need to define which are the channels or the ways that you want to do the interaction with other people. The process of check the advances, and the last one is the process of deprecation. These 8 steps you need to consider in a plan. This plan needs to contain all of these things. So let's start with define the goal. And the goal, this is an excellent phrase from Martin Fowler, and I think this applies. If you want to do the migration just for the migration or the deprecation just for the deprecation, not makes sense. If I say you, okay, I want to deprecate these microservices, and you say me, why? Oh, because I want to use a new framework. Ah, great. It's not my priority. I will continue using the Oswald. This is not a good reason. And instead, if you say, okay, I want to deprecate this all microservices because I want to increase the performance, decrease the latency when you send me a request. This give you, give more precision about certain information that I respond. All these kind of things are different and show to your consumers like a propose. Okay, my idea is for this, for this, for this, and your consumers say, oh, okay, I want this migration because it's a good approach and have a lot of benefits, and it's possible to execute. Okay, the next is how to find the consumers. This is the main problem on a migration plan. And you need to consider different alternatives. There is not just one silver bullet for this. The first one is you can use an APM like New Relic or Dynatrace or ALK to find the consumer. There are a lot of service map services. So you find your microservices and say, okay, these microservices connect with, and you have more or less which others inside of your company use your microservices. Perhaps not all the microservices or not all the application appear on these tools, and for this, try to use logs like Logstash, OpenSearch, and many other tools which give you information about the request and the response that your microservices receive. And perhaps in the metadata of these logs appear, I don't know, the IP, the client name, or some kind of information that help you to find a new consumers. And the last one, which is not recommended, but perhaps this happen, is find other tools like Confluence, emails, I don't know, any kind of documentation that say, okay, I have a call with this team or with this person outside of the company, and I send my Swagger, and so, okay, I need to contact with that person. With the combination of all these kind of things, you will have like a list on your plan, and you say, these are all my consumers. And so with this in consideration, you need to define the deadlines. Depending the different things, okay, you need to define early adopters. Early adopters on your consumers, and you need to research or find like friends that when you send a problem on your microservice and say, oh, my fault, I will add a new attribute, please try to use the latest version of these microservices, or I will add a new attribute while I will remove, and quickly say, okay, great, thank you for your advice, and introduce the modification. This is like a friend that will help you that this migration or deprecation process will happen. It's outside of your team, but inside of your company in most of the cases. The second team or the second group is internal consumer, are people inside or teams inside of your company that are not close to you. You don't have a lot of interaction during day to day. So perhaps if you send an email or contact is, oh yeah, I will do it, but I don't have a lot of time. Let me think. And you need to define like a second deadline for that person. And the last one is external consumers. And in this case, you imply that you need to think in a way, a flexible way. It's not like, okay, my internal consumer in 1 quarter, and my external in after that quarter in, I don't know, 3 weeks. No, this does not happen. You need to be flexible and consider a lot of things. How many external consumers you have in your API? So, things that you need to consider in a strategy. What happened with the new features or the bugs? What you want to do? You will fix the bugs in both versions or just in one of them. How you roll out the new changes or the new microservices all together, just one endpoint at a time. What is your approach? How check the results? What strategy you want to do? Okay, how you check the results in your microservices, and how you check or measure the advance of these changes. This is connected with the previous one. How check the advance? You want to use, I don't know, New Relic to check how many requests your API continue receiving week to week or day to day, or I don't know, you will use Logstash. You need to find a way to measure how many requests each time or each period or each period that you want to check decrease or not. Next one, the early adopters. As I mentioned, you need to define as the set. It's not a good idea have a huge list of early adopters. It's like 3 or 4 early adopters which you have close communication and will help you to find or discover problem on your implementation or in your documentation. The last one, what happened with the request after the deadline? Okay. Appear the deadline of the external consumers, and what happened with the new request? What we want to do with this? So, who are the responsibles of this? Who track the advance? The business analyst, the technical leader, both a manager. Who you need to define a list of responsible on your team. How communicate with the consumers? Perhaps you have the responsible, okay, for track the advance of the migration process or deprecation in the role of business analyst. And in the case that something strange happened with the documentation and you need to have a meeting, perhaps this involves that you create a meet with the developers of both teams, just in case. Who create the technical documentation? Who could be the same person, could be another one, could be the technical leader of the team or the company, and validate with the business analyst with the approach that need to be clear and need to be something that it's simple for the people who read this document. And how many people need to be responsible? My suggestion, don't delegate everything to just one person. The idea is that someone in your company or in your team is responsible to track the entire process, but there are many tasks as you see inside of a plan, and some are delegable. For example, the create the technical documentation could be done by a business analyst, by a technical leader or developer, and the business analyst could track the entire process of the migration or responsible of that. Okay, how define the communication methods? Well, not all your consumers have the same methods to communicate. So perhaps some of them use, I don't know, Slack. Another one use Teams. Another one prefer a call communication, and another one prefer only an email. So at some point you need to map all your consumers and with the preferred method of communication. So okay, send an email for all your consumers, but in the case that something happened or you don't have a response, you need to have like a map and say, okay, I sent an email, but the best way that this consumer answer and send me a status about the migration process is call, have a call with this, have a meeting, all these kind of things. And how to track the advance? Okay, well, you need to define the frequency to check the advance. Once a week, one a month, one in a day. This is not real. But you need to define the period or the frequency to track this advance. After that, who is the responsible for each consumer? In the case that you have a big number of external consumers or internal consumers, my suggestion is like split the consumers in 3 or 2 or 4 or any number of groups and delegate to one person in particular. Okay, try to communicate with all these consumers and try to track the advance. Because if you have, I don't know, 100 consumers, one person, one business analyst, it's impossible that find or communicate or track the advance of all these kind of consumers. Imagine in the case that each consumer represents a particular company. So you spend a lot of time to do it. And define the tool or the strategy to verify the advance or track if you want or you prefer track the advance by in a Excel document or something like that. But you need to have a real tool that give you information about the number of requests that your API receive, if there is some change week to week or month to month with the number of requests, or if some endpoint don't receive more any kind of requests. Define the deprecation process. Okay, this is the last part of the process, and you need to consider different aspects before doing the deprecation, because okay, you need to send a final notification for your consumer. And this is so important because most of the consumers perhaps did the migration at some point in the past, but perhaps someone missed the deadline. So it's important to say a final notification to your consumer. Okay, this is the final notification. Next, by the end of the next month, we will deprecate this series of endpoint or the entire microservices. Please do the migration after that deadline. It's not my business. It's not my responsibility. And you can throw exception in the case that you detect when you track the advance. Imagine that you track the advance week to week and you detect that one particular endpoint or two different endpoints don't receive any kind of request for that period. So the best alternative when you want to deprecate and all microservices is modify the behavior of that microservices to throw exception. So if any of the consumer don't use more this endpoint, just in case that someone send the same swagger or the documentation to another person, and this person decide to, or this consumer decide to start to consume all microservices, is like, okay, the migration of this endpoint is these true endpoints, it's finished. And if someone do a request, will receive an exception. So use the new one, sorry. So the next step, my suggestion is stop on not productive environments. So I stop some endpoints that are not non-usable, non-received request. The next step is stop the microservices in non-productive environment when the deprecation process starts. The next is, okay, you can reject or redirect all the requests. It's your decision. Okay, I will reject all the requests. If someone send an HTTP request to this particular endpoint, I will configure something in my infrastructure and will return an exception. Or I will redirect, or I will create some mechanism to transform the old request to the new request and redirect internally, so the consumer doesn't know about this migration process. So I do the redirect. This is your decision. And the last one is stop the microservices on non-productive environment. In productive environment. This is the last step. When this situation happens, everything is dead with the old microservices. So this is all the parts of the plan. You created the microservices because it's our second step in this. This is 5 steps. The third step is, okay, and the second and the third is create and check the new microservices. So you need to analyze and define which endpoints and with the request and response that you will create in the new microservices, because perhaps not all the microservices are not all the endpoints are necessary. Next one, it's validate the endpoint. At some point you say, okay, this endpoint it's okay. The request and the response works fine, don't have a performance issue, everything looks fine for me. Next, it's document the process. So at some point you need to say, okay, to do the migration, you need to do this, this, and this. And this request change the name of the endpoint to this one. This attribute change the name, or change the meaning, or change the type of the attribute. And the last step is roll out and deploy the new microservices. The new microservices could stay at production without receiving any kind of requests. So you start the process, deprecate, document, everything looks fine, and you deploy on production. This does not imply that you will receive instantaneously requests on this endpoint. Notify and check the consumers. This is the most relevant part of our plan. Imagine in the first part of this talk, I defined all the steps of a plan. Now we are in progress. We execute the plan. So you need to communicate using different methods. As I mentioned, you need to define like document with all the possible method of communication. At this point, you will detect possible problems on the plan, like I don't know, the documentation is not correct, is have a lot of things that are not clear, or give me a lot of duties to execute this plan, and it's impossible to achieve the goal on, I don't know, in 1 week. So you need to discuss with your consumers your plan. In the case that something bad happened because something is not clear, or your consumer follow all the steps on your documentation, but for some reason the request and the response fail, you need to coordinate with your team, with your developer team, meetings with your consumers to check what happened in that situation. As you saw during this talk, there are a lot of things that imply communication, a lot of things that imply that someone track and is responsible for the entire process. So it's not something, as I mentioned, that one person could do alone. You need to register the advance of each consumer. It's like this consumer do the entire process of migration. This consumer just migrate one endpoint. The other one are continue using the old microservices. Adjust the deadlines and the documentation, considering that the problem that could appear during this process, because when you track the advance of on each meeting, perhaps you discover that something is missing in the documentation, or perhaps and in the case that you you discover that something is wrong in the documentation, perhaps you need to consider and adjust the deadlines to consider these kind of failures. So, last step. After some weeks, months, years, at some period of time, you will deprecate. You will stop the microservices. So, as I mentioned, send a grateful notification. In most of the cases, some of the providers of these endpoints send in a header the sunset. So in the case that your consumers have some kind of mechanism to detect the sunset is like a header when you say where you say, okay, until this date, this endpoint will continue working, and after that, perhaps an exception occurs. This is a kind way to notify your consumers. Perhaps in most of the cases, your consumer don't understand this because don't read all the headers. After that, send a notification to all the consumers that you will deprecate this endpoint. This is not implied, okay, I will send a notification just for my consumer who don't do the migration. No, send all your consumers just in case that someone do the migration and for some reason don't deploy the migration, the migration process, the modification on their productive environments. So send notification for all of them. After that, my suggestion is start to redirect or reject. So it's your choice. Decide which of these approach is the best for you. Is the same in the case that you choose redirect, taking consideration that if the old endpoint and the new one change a lot, in that case you will need to add a lot of logic at some point on your infrastructure, and someone need to maintain this transformation. So it's not the best alternative. I know there are many cases where you need to do it, but it's not the best approach. Last one, remove the microservices in all the environments, your infrastructure. So, best practices for this migration of don't remove my API. Create a plan, define all the steps that you need to follow, and more or less try to be with a huge level of detail in each of the steps, the responsible of the communication, the method that you will use, which are the early adopters, the deadline. Try to define with a huge level of detail. After that, require confirmation. This is so important. When you send an email or contact by Slack, Teams, or any kind of method that you want to use and talk with your consumers, require a confirmation. Okay, you read the entire document and the plan, you understand everything is okay for you. Okay, great. And you mark on your plan like, okay, this consumer have the notification and this is the only things that you need to do. After that, adjust the plan. In the case that something happened during the migration process, is an error in documentation, something is not clear, or perhaps a problem appeared during the process because you introduce a bug on the new version of the microservices, adjust the deadlines. Consider these kind of things. It's not like the deadline is next week and we adjust the deadline, I don't know, for the next year. No, the idea is have some kind of little adjustments. It's like, okay, we discover a bug in this endpoint, perhaps we can postpone the migration or the deadline a couple of weeks. Stop slow, not stop everything together is a bad practice. Try to stop slowly, like on non-productive environment, and after that do it in the productive environment. This is a good way to detect consumers that are outside of your radar. It's like, oh, I don't have in in my APM, in my logs, or my documentation, appear a new consumer. So at some point, appear when you stop slowly and stop in non-productive environments, there are a lot of people which say, or tell by Slack, this happened to me, and this something is wrong in these microservices, and was why you use these microservices. And now try to do it slowly. Okay, the first, as I mentioned, it's not all required. There are some steps that are optional, like the creation and the check the status of the microservices, because as I mentioned, perhaps you first create your microservices and after that you decide to create a plan. Define the responsibilities, try to have more than one responsible for each kind of task or each communication. And by the end of this talk, here are some books. Some of them are connected with different strategies of testing, different strategies to do the migration, and best practices to documenting the process of the migration. And here are some blogs that will help you with tons of different advice or suggestions. So thank you for assist to this talk.
Okay, thank you, Andres, for this nice overview. Well, in a nutshell, I think it's always a good idea to have a plan before you're doing something complex. I was told that we actually out of time for questions here online, but after this section, we will have a discussion section, and I ask everybody who is with us right now, watching us in real time, to join the discussion session. And another thing that I would like to ask you is to rate this talk. Your feedback is very important because it helps us to make conference better. For speakers, it helps speakers to make their presentations better. So please send your feedback and rate this talk. Okay, and I think we are finishing this section, and let's see everyone in a live discussion.